you know, Ali and Frazier. It's 1971. That was the start of, that was the fight. 60s passed on. Now, Joe Frazier, 64 Olympic gold medal winner. Ali, 1960 gold medal winner, light heavyweight division, of course. But now he's been the champ for a few years. He came in, lost whatever. It took his title away from him, but he had the rematches with Liston. Remember that? He had rematches with Liston. On top of that, I think he fought Patterson twice, if I can remember. If I'm correct, I think he even fought
Yeah, he
Patterson
did. I
two
mean,
times.
Patterson was dead, pretty
Yeah,
much
he was
dead by the second one. His back would give out if he sneezed, but
I think
the first
I
fight was good.
Yeah, I think Liston broke his back when he fought him the first time. He just went to take the fight for the rematch. But
Yeah.
I mean, up and up until that time, you lost. And after about that period, I think you lost were the great fighters. Up until probably, I'm trying to think, and maybe even in the '70s, you had a couple of good fights. That rematches, not many, but television started to kind of take over, and then promoters like Don King came into the game. Aram started playing in the game. You had the other guys, and they were pretty much controlling the television markets. ABC, NBC, CBS, they were pretty much controlling. They wanted to put a fight on based on how a fighter looked. Emil Griffith was doing that period of time as well, and he was perhaps the most well-known fighter in America because of the Gillette Friday Night Fights. He fought in the Garden, I think, more time than anybody did. I can't remember the exact amount of times, but he fought there. The Garden was like his home. He built boxing in the Garden. So when you look into this period where fighters, as far as to rematches, you get to the '71 fight, Frazier and Ali, that had been built up on a lot of different things, culture wise. Ali, of course, had his fans. And then you had the thing where people said, because, the Vietnam War played a big part in that as well. That was, again, Ali refused to change his name, of course. They refused to go into the military. They stripped his title. So, and you had Black America, who was coming just out of a period of integration, coming to a period of integration, but more segregation and everything that had taken place up in that period of time. And I think, and I don't think this because I knew it growing up as a kid, I heard people have this. There were a lot of people that seen this as a defining moment in the history of sports, because Joe Frazier was the American dream himself, on the farm and with his grandfather down in Columbia, South Carolina, came to Philadelphia, took up boxing, went to the Olympics, and he was the American dream.
He inspired the Rocky movies pretty much.
Yes,
They were
much.
literally about him. And then they finally have a statue of him now, but for years they just had a statue of
Rocky.
Stallone.
No, Sylvester Stallone, not Rocky. Sylvester Stallone. And I think after a while he started to believe it, that he was really Rocky. But along with that, Joe Frazier was that people saw Ali as fighting the American dream. Joe Frazier was a Black man, but they saw him carrying with the American flag. You're the one that's been part of our oppressors for so many years. And so,
well, they were drafting a crazy amount. I think an overrepresented amount of young Black men into the war, as opposed to white people. And so when Ali said, "No, I'm not," you want me to go to war and you're not even treating my people right here,
right.
that resonated really deeply, I'm sure, with a lot of people. And Frazier made the mistake, I think, of volunteering without being provoked into asking, even a lot of times, that he was against what Ali was doing, that he should have let himself be drafted. And I remember seeing an interview of this, and someone asked him, "What do you think about Ali?" And he goes, "I mean, he needs to go into the army and fight for his country." And the interviewer wasn't even asking that. He's like, "Oh no, I mean, like, how would you match up against him?" So I think that it was 100% unfair of Ali to start casting Frazier the way he casted him, as like, you know, anti-black, anti-this,
Yeah.
anti-that. But it's not like Frazier didn't in certain ways antagonize Ali into that as well. And I
Well,
think
but
you have
this,
the basis there for a very bad start of a relationship,
well,
to say the
what you,
least.
but what you actually had, David, was a young man at the time, as Joe Frazier was, even though he was champion of the world, put up against a journalist that once he made a mistake, a guy that's professed at writing, and he made a mistake, and rather than taking that story where it should have been by saying, no, I was just talking about the fight, but what do you mean about the, now, Joe Frazier's not, you know, he's just speaking from his heart. So
Yeah,
what
no,
he
he's not equipped to deal with that kind of thing. He's a boxer.
to deal with that. Because
Yeah.
he grew up on the farm with his father, and he probably had people in his arm, and his father went to the war in the World War II and other times. So he probably had people go into the war and saw them lose their lives and come back. So he thought that to him, that was you wore it with armor. You know, what do they call it? You wore it in your chest. It was like, hey, man, you served your country. Joe Louis, you know.
Well, World War II is a really easy case to make. Like,
yes.
it's, you know, it's like,
yes.
There's no dispute about if you were on the right side of that, if that was a good war to go to, you know?
And everybody, and prior to the Vietnam, but prior to that, the war came to television in the late 1960s. And so what happened was people over there started seeing young boys getting blown up over there. Now you got Martin Luther King speaking against the war. Malcolm X during that period of time speaking against all these guys, all these civil rights leaders are saying, well, it's not right that we should be over in the war in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson is trying to get out of there, but Kennedy, he had been put into something. It was a hotbed. So now you got Ali saying, but ain't no Vietnam, no Viet Cong ever called me no nigga. Well, that really never had anything to do with it, you know. But again, you got these guys that are not professed at as sharp, as quick-witted as Ali was.
What do you mean? What do you mean that didn't have anything to do with it?
Well, it's because as sharp as Ali, okay, but it started with Ali being in the Muslims. See, they never really kind of accepted that part of him either. The fact that he gave up his birth name, changed it, and became a Muslim.
That was hugely controversial.
That was very
to
huge,
say the least. Yeah.
To say the least. So you had a lot of black people that really didn't like that. Okay, because why? There was a certain fear in the black community of the Nation of Islam. They didn't understand it. They saw it as a lot of guys that, you know, I can say it for myself, in my neighborhood, a lot of guys had been to prison, and they came back, they were Muslim, right? And they wore these bow ties, they were selling bean pies and the Muhammad speaks on the corners. But there was a certain fear that people had of them. So Ali comes out and he's he's saying, look, we're just like everybody else. We're peaceful people. But that wasn't grasped then in the 60s like that. And even in the 70s, it wasn't that way. So Joe Frazier is confronted with both of these. The Muslim, not going to the army. Now you got a newspaper guy that can sit there and make you say things before you know it. And you know how they write, if you don't say off the record, then if you say off the record, it's going to matter. It's going to show up somewhere. So now the story gets twisted. So by the time it comes time, Ali has been stripped of his title, right? Joe Frazier decides, okay, we're going to make this fight take place. So he goes and sees Ali. They meet each other. They talk about it in the car. He gives Ali a ride he had a Rolls Royce at this time. He gives Ali a ride in his car. You know, they talking, and he even loaned Ali money to help get the guy back on his feet.
I've read that conversation. I think it's in either Frazier's book or Ali's book, and it's a fascinating conversation. Frazier tells him how he's going to fight him too.
Yeah,
and Ali doesn't listen.
Doesn't at all. You know. So, but the thing about it, Joe said while they're sitting in the car, and I had the conversation with Joe, so I know I'm not. We had like you and I talking now. But he said they're talking. He said they pull up, and then all of a sudden, people come to the car. This guy goes crazy. Joe Frazier, you ugly. I'm gonna be. He said, wait a minute, what happened to the guy that was just sitting in the car? He just went out because the crowd came, but was he selling the fight, selling something? Maybe he was. I don't, Joe didn't understand it because after that point on, it became a thing of now. Joe Frazier, American flag, what they call it, apple pie and iced tea, whatever the song. Have someone go Coca-Cola base, but this one Coca-Cola
Whatever
baseball,
American
apple
imagery
pie.
you want to invoke,
Like
yeah.
Whatever you want to invoke, that's what Joe Frazier was. Ali wasn't. So, in those people that didn't believe in the war, he had out on this side. Those people who wanted to carry the American flag on their shoulders and their hands, he had on this side. The black people who wanted, who Ali stood up for not being drafted, you had that side. Then you had those black guys that had been to the army and served graciously during the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. They didn't like it either. So now you got a country that's divided. But this fight gets made based more on that than it was, I'm telling you, than it was just the talent of what it was. It wasn't always, because it almost didn't happen. It really? Almost didn't happen. Joe Frazier, Ali was not the top contender. He was not. He came back and fought a couple of guys. I think he usually fight Quarry, a couple of guys, and somebody else. But he wasn't the number one. There were a couple of guys that were ahead of him. But the name, and if they had decided to say, look, we're going to strip you, because I think he was at one time threatened to be stripped by one of the organizations. They said, because they said he didn't deserve to fight for the title again. Now, he wasn't American. But now that's what started to build this whole thing up. So all of a sudden, not only did this particular fight create a national divide, David, it created a fashion culture. Because that particular night, if you look and see the clothes that the guys were wearing, it brought all the pimps and the hustlers and the hookers and the stars. Everybody came out that night. Everybody. This was the fight. New York was the place to be. Fashion, all of a sudden, the big hats came in. You know, the fur guys wearing the fur coats. Oh, man, it was my man didn't wear fur coats prior to that. I think the only guy who wore a fur coat in New York then was Clyde Frazier, who played for the Knicks, because that's just how cool he was, you know. But
I didn't know pimps actually dressed in this fashion anymore until I visited Oakland a couple times when I lived in San Francisco. And I'm like, oh, that's an actual thing. That's not just for movies. That's an actual legitimate thing.
I lived out there. When I was in college during that time, I seen it every day. Guys riding down the street in their Cadillacs with lean back with the big hats on. Hey man, that was the West Coast. But that style, you see, so that fight brought in everything you could think of. Cultural, religious, fashions. Man, it was nothing like that. And I don't think, to be honest with you, I don't think there's been one like that since. The rematch.
Frazier was not prepared for all that, man.
No, by no means.
No, he wasn't. He did not position himself to be the champion of any kind of cause besides I want to win fights. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden he's put in this position where he's supposedly leading, you know, for but a brief moment, this cultural war that's the opposite of what Ali's trying to do. Yes. His kids are getting like picked on in school for it. He's getting like random strangers who just hate him. He was not ready for any of this, and I don't think it was his intention at all.
It never was for a young boy that came from South Carolina to Philadelphia to be a fighter. That wasn't his thing. He just wanted to fight. He would have fought Ali in a phone booth if he could. He said it. He said, I fought him in a phone booth because he was so sure he could beat him. That was not, and he wanted to prove. People are saying, then Ali, people were saying, oh, you can't do this because Ali had been the champ and never lost the title. And Joe Frazier said, and Ali would have those things. Who's the champ? He goes, Ali, all of a sudden. So now Joe is like, I've got to prove them wrong. And that night in the Garden, it was a thing where he was here to show Joe Louis. I keep saying, well, Joe Louis was ringside, but Joe Frazier was there to prove to the world. And he was willing to die. He said, I'm going to stick right there. I'm going to, as Ali was.
He wasn't just willing to die, man. He was ready to kill. In his book, he talks about how in the dressing room, he stopped, looked in the mirror, and then just prayed to God to give him the strength to kill Ali.
Kill Ali.
Now, you don't, if you believe in a divine being, and you're praying to that divine being to help you kill someone, then obviously you think that the divine being is going to side with you on this. Otherwise, you wouldn't be asking him to help you commit murder. So
Well,
that was Joe Frazier's opinion of Ali back then, to the point
yes.
where he was so certain that he was just an evil person that he believed the creator himself would side with him on this
Well,
and
because
help him
again,
out.
well, because remember, Ali, the Muslim, the Christianity. If you
Hmm.
believe in Jesus, you believe in God, God and Jesus. That's you can't. It's this thing with David, the David and the Goliath. I use that, right?
Hmm.
Where David goes and says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that's coming up to rise up against the living God?" Joe Frazier had that in his mind. That's what he was fighting. It was David against Goliath. It wasn't Ali and just Ali and Frazier. So that all of that stuff was there. And you know, Ali started coming with the rhymes. I'm gonna be picking and poking. Joe Frazier said, I'm gonna come in on smoking. Ali said, I'm gonna be picking and poking, pouring water on while you smoking. You know, those are kind of so, but then it started to get ugly after a while.
Hmm.
And when the ugliness turned into it, I think that's when really the divide got even bigger.
Because you could tell, like you could tell when fighters are putting on, just putting on a show,
Oh
you
yeah.
know, and you could
Yeah.
tell when like Frazier legitimately hated Ali at that
He
point in his
disliked
life.
Ali, and
Yeah.
probably until 2000. Be honest with you, I don't think it took a, and I think the love, the closeness that he and my brother and Ali got over the years is
Mm.
what brought that together. The
Mm.
three of them, you know, because George started preaching in the late 70s and became a whole different person himself by the time and Joe and Ali became his best friends.
Mm.
But yeah, at that time, George was trying to get in the mix with him too, right? But Lee, at that time,
I just love that it happened the same way as when you get into a fight like in elementary school. Like you know you fight the person and then all of a sudden you're friends afterwards.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
like pretty,
yeah,
you know, it's
yeah.
like pretty much that same thing. The only difference is it took like 3 fights and they were all insanely epic. You
It
know.
took 14 years. Yeah, because it took 3 fights in 14 years before they even could basically be in the same room without disliking each other. And of course, that night in the fight, you know, I've looked at that fight a couple of times, and I have Joe winning the fight by at least 2 or 3 rounds each time I see it, because Ali did what, you know, it shows you a lot about even the years Ali missed out of the ring. It
Mm.
shows you what he could have, what he had he probably stayed on top of his game, because he stayed in there with this guy, man. Joe Frazier was a machine that night, throwing
Yep.
bodies, hooks, and shot. Then finally in the 15th round, you know, it was kind of like, okay, man, this is it. Bam, that's it. You know,
For that to happen in the very last round is
yeah.
like one of the most sports movies things. That was like it was like a Rocky movie, except the
Yeah,
action was good
yeah,
instead of really
yeah.
terrible.
Instead of faked up, right?
Yeah.
Rocket didn't hit the ground with his mitts and run out around the ring, turn his back, and the referee don't count. Yeah, I hate those movies. Anyway, but when you saw that, what you realized then, Joe Frazier is king of the hill, because at that moment, even if the fight was close, that was, now you got a 10-8 round. You know,
That was when Frazier immortalized himself.
that's when he immortalized
Was when,
himself.
you know, before, like, you know, being the heavyweight champion of the world is really impressive. But after he beat Ali, he became a legend. And after that,
Yes,
it doesn't matter how many times he loses to Ali.
didn't matter.
He's still
He
legendary.
beat him at the time that it counted,
Hmm.
because he went on and had a couple other fights. Of course, he fought George. He lost the title to George. He fought George in the rematch. But then in between that, Ali and Frazier fought in the second fight. That is, it just wasn't there. You know, I mean, it was big because they tried to make it to what it was the first time, but it couldn't be, because first there was no title at stake.
That's still, everyone disagrees with me on this, but that's still my favorite of the 3 fights.
The second fight,
The second fight, because, and
yeah, I like it too.
I point this out to people and then they'll watch it again and then they'll be like, oh yeah, but I will argue, you know, until I can't speak anymore, that that's the best fight because it had the best action, but the camera angle was, and the production was terrible. Like you can't see what's going on half the time.
Yeah, they
You what
missed
all
a
you
lot of. You're absolutely right. A lot of the punches were out of angle. You know,
Yeah,
when
like you
not in the
see
ground.
Ali's
You're
back and then
right.
his arms going like that.
Yep,
It's
you're
it's
right.
not
You're
it's not
absolutely
until
right.
you slow it down that you see what's going on. And
You're absolutely
I
right.
just really wish there was an alternative camera angle somewhere, because I will argue, and people don't need to. No one agrees with me. I understand this. No one agrees with me that the second fight was the best. But if you get the chance, watch it in slow motion, and you could make out what's going on. And I wish that we could see it, because it was amazing what was going on.
I,
Frazier was dialed, like Ali had his speed back at that point and his legs
yeah,
back a little
yeah,
bit more than,
yeah.
and Frazier still, Frazier got slower in my opinion for the third fight, but he still
Well,
had most of his
Frazier had
speed
felt.
here too.
Well, Frazier had felt the effects of the punches that George had given him in
Yes.
that fight. He hadn't recovered from that. You
Yeah.
know, that fight went out when they fought again, of course, but you know, it was a fight that had to take place more or less because of money.
Mm.
But the effects of that had not shaken off from him during that time. So the second fight, they both were fighting to get back somewhere again. Ali wanted that. He knew that if he wanted to fight for the title again, he had to fight Joe Frazier, and he had
Yeah.
to beat Joe Frazier. Right? He had to beat him. The
Had to.
Norton fight, the Norton thing was one thing. You know, he lost the fight to Norton, of course, you know, between that. But that was because Norton was kind of insignificant even at that point then. But he had to
Norton was
beat
the
Joe.
best thing for Ali because he woke him
The
up.
best. Yes, he
Yeah,
woke him.
because
Yes,
like he could excuse, like, oh, it's those are white men's judges or whatever for the first fight. It's like, okay, Ali, whatever. But he couldn't do that with Norton.
He
Like
couldn't
he
do
broke
that.
his jaw. He broke his jaw.
Yep.
That's where he checked his ego and was like, oh man, I need to get back into shape, and then took the second fight. And so
And
by the
I
time he
think
got
that
to the second Frazier fight, he's looking a lot better than he was.
a lot better, really, because that's why I say in the first fight you have to realize what kind of athlete he was, because man, anybody that had been off like he had been off, and listen, he only fought Quarry, and I think somebody, I can't remember somebody, so he might have had another fight if he did, but he didn't have that 2 years to fight and get his rhythm, get his weight down to exactly where he was when he was at 210 pounds floating boxing. He didn't have the time for that. Now, you had to go while that fight was there. But when I seen what this guy actually, and then to get knocked down like that and get up, I mean, it was over with by that time, you know. And it was, but that just like you said, that was the exclamation point. Period. Boom. That this is Joe Frazier's fight. The second fight, again, as you said, by this time I'm a little old. I'm paying attention to things. George had won the title by that time, and I was in high school, but I'm in college. For by the time their rematch comes along. But then when they get to the Thrilla in Manila, George had beaten Joe before that again in the rematch. So when he fought Ali, the Thrilla in Manila, I actually looked at that fight as being, because I knew Ali was not going. I had tried to get a rematch with Ali and George. We tried for the longest to get that fight.
Yeah, I know.
It wasn't happening. Ali just wasn't. He fought I always tell people, as much as I admired him, he fought everybody 2 and 3 times except George. And George gave him the shot at the title when he didn't have to, because the money. It was because of the money. But by the third fight, I really seen that as 2 fighters that was really on the downside of their career.
Right.
Because they left
but
whatever they had in that ring.
But that's the funny thing, is that they were both derated a little bit, but they met perfectly in the middle.
Perfectly.
For each other's skills.
Like Mickey Ward and Arturo Gatti. Both those guys, you look at that fight, they weren't going to beat anybody in the top echelon of boxing, but they were made for each other.
They were.
They were to make those.
They were made for good fights.
They were made for good fights, and that's what that fight was. I think that was the last hurrah that you saw of Ali. From that point on, became just me. He was an average fighter.
He should have retired right exactly at that moment right there. But Frazier, I think, hated him even more after that fight for a number of years, right?
Yeah, he did.
He felt he could have gotten the last round too, and then won it.
But Eddie Futch stopped it, and probably
he should have.
He said I was trying to save his life. He cared more about that kid.
He loved him, and then Frazier, he knew how Frazier was going to react to it too.
Yeah, he knew, but that's okay, because you know what? That's the reason you can see today. That's the reason you still, and Joe still had he was Joe Frazier till the end. I think that, by that time, everybody says the Thriller in Manila because they felt they got the best out of each other that night. But I don't think that night, if any of them would have been against any of other George that night, or maybe even another Norton, as we saw against Ali years later, a time later, Larry Holmes, I don't think they beat either one. You know what I mean? Neither one of them can beat any one of those guys at that time.
It was one of those perfect storms where they just needed to fight each other.
But again, it was the perfect cultural fight for 1971 to 1977. That period of time, David, it was in boxing. Those guys brought in closed circuit television. They almost literally brought it out again because by that period of time, they started going to home pay-per-view. But they were the start of everything that boxing was supposed to have been, coming from television to big screen, closed circuits, people dressing up to go out and watch. That I can't even tell you what it was like to see guys, man. All of a sudden, people have seen this guy at the fight. Then all of a sudden, you go downtown, and the guy you just saw at the fight, if you went to see it on closed circuit or wherever you saw the replay at, you seen a guy, and all of a sudden downtown Houston is 80 degrees, but he's walking around with a big hat on his head and, big belts and high-buckle shoes, high-heel shoes. Fashion culture. I'm saying that fight brought everything: social, the religious part of it, the patriotic part, as well as the fashion. And not another one since that day has been like that.
Maybe that's what we need nowadays.
Yeah, we could use something like that.
Yeah, like stop fighting in the streets, stop storming buildings. Just for pick a guy and then live vicariously.
Exactly. That's what you do. That's what we need. I mean, but when and by the time when Tyson came along, well, in the period of time you had that low period of time, but in the 80s Tyson comes in, he creates a good buzz in the heavyweight division, boxing for a while. Iron Mike, this and that. But again, he kind of played out. Because again, his lifestyle, he brought in a certain lifestyle fashion. He came in with the Versace shirts and, guys were wearing the gold chains and the haircut styles and as crazy as you thought they were.
No, he definitely became a part of culture too, but nothing like he was never man. Like an avatar of an ideal. Unless the ideal is like, I'm going to eat your children, which isn't much of an ideal. No. I got you while you were drinking. My wife always hates it when I do that.
But yeah, you're absolutely right, though. But a great period, probably perhaps the greatest. That's why I think it goes down as the greatest decade in boxing, the 70s, the 1970s.
Hard to argue with that. All right, let's talk about
the whole thing that ended that fight, like I say, is like the name of our part. Ali didn't see the left foot coming. And it was a punch that all the night long he had been dodging. But it was a punch that he didn't see. And that was the left foot that Joe Frazier brought him in with, that dropped him on the floor. And to me, I mean, that didn't define the fight to me, because I thought he won the fight. But that was everybody else. That was an exclamation point, like I said, period, exclamation point.
Yeah, and he told him he was going to do it in the car too.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, I remember reading the book, and he literally tells him how he's going to set him up and knock him out. I guess
knock him out.
Yeah, he should have listened.
He should have listened.